There are places in this world where the silence carries more weight than words, where the trees lean close, as if guarding something unspeakable, and where the wind itself seems to whisper of names long forgotten. This is one of those places, the Appalachian settlement that swallowed 97 people in less than 3 decades and left nothing but questions behind. What happened here is not folklore, nor the invention of frightened minds. It is a truth carved into the soil of a land that does not forgive and will not release its secrets easily. Imagine standing on a dirt path in the early morning mist, hearing nothing but your own breath and the crunch of your boots, and realizing you are walking the same ground, where entire families disappeared without a sound, not a scream, not a struggle, only vanishing as though the earth itself opened its jaws to feed on them. The official records mention little because institutions survive on silence and erasure. But the whispers never stopped. They said the hills themselves were hungry. They said the settlement had been cursed. They said the people who lived there practiced rites older than the Christian faith, older than the nation itself. They said the missing were not stolen by time, but by hands cloaked in ritual and power. What you are about to hear is not just a story. It is an initiation into the shadows of history, where the truth is forbidden because it unmasks the machinery of control that has kept men obedient for centuries. This settlement is not only a tale of disappearance, it is a mirror reflecting how fear and silence become weapons wielded by those who thrive on darkness. If you stay with me through this descent, you will never again look at the forested ridges of the Appalachian Range with the same innocence. For this is not just about 97 lost souls. It is about the system that let them be taken, the hidden hands that profit for vanishing lives, and the truth that we were never meant to uncover. You are standing at the edge of a forbidden door, and once it opens, there is no turning back. The first official disappearance was noted in the year 1827. A young man who had come to the mountains in search of work, cutting timber and clearing trails. His name was recorded in the town ledgers, but his body was never found. They said he wandered too far, and the forest claimed him, but his belongings were discovered, stacked neatly by the riverbank, as if placed with intention, as if someone wanted his absence to look like an accident. That was the first, and it would not be the last. Within 5 years, whole households had vanished, cabins left standing with fires still burning, and food still warm on the tables. Livestock, unfed children's toys, abandoned in the dirt. All of it silent. No trace of struggle, no sign of flight. The authorities who came were not strangers to death, but even they could not explain what they saw. They marked the files with vague words: accident wilderness, disappearance, and then closed them quickly, because to dig deeper would have meant admitting something larger was at work. For those who remained in nearby towns, there grew a fear that was sharper than any blade. Men whispered that the settlement had been built on land already consecrated to older forces, that the soil beneath the cabins drank blood long before the first settlers came. Every tree, every stream, every shadow was believed to carry a presence, watching, measuring, deciding when to take the next soul. Those who spoke too loudly about these disappearances often moved away soon after, or fell into silence, as if something persuaded them to forget. Yet forgetting is not natural. It is trained, imposed, forced by powers that benefit from silence. Because when men vanish without answers, when women and children are erased without explanation, it is never just wilderness. It is never just chance. It is the hand of something organized, something concealed, and something protected by institutions that pre-fee our myths to truth. This settlement was not simply a place where people lived. It was a place where they were fed into a system hidden beneath the surface of American history, a system that devours while pretending not to exist. 97 disappearances over 27 years could never be chance. They were a pattern, a ritual, an operation unfolding under the nose of a nation, distracted by wars, expansion, and progress. By the year 1834, the whispers had grown louder, but so had the fear. Each time someone vanished, the officials claimed wilderness dangers or frontier hardship. Yet the stories never aligned. How could an entire family vanish overnight, leaving no tracks, no blood, no signs of departure? How could a cabin stand locked from the inside, with no living soul within, and no broken windows or forced doors? There were accounts of neighbors hearing voices in the night, chants that were not prayers, and drums that beat low through the hills when the moon was high. The people who heard them swore it was not human music, but something older, something that pulled at the bones and unsettled the mind. Some tried to speak of it in churches, but were quickly silenced. Their words drowned in sermons about obedience and sin. What they did not understand was that silence was being engineered. Fear was being cultivated. Because when men are afraid, they can be controlled, and when whole communities are erased, their land and resources can be claimed without question. This is how institutions thrive. They dress power in the garments of law and faith, while their hands do the work of predators. And so, the Appalachian settlement became a wound, hidden beneath layers of official denial, while the real story lived only in secret journals, letters, and the trembling voices of those who dared to remember. 97 vanished. But how many more were erased from record entirely? How many were buried in unmarked ground? Their bones never counted, their names never spoken again. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that this was not wilderness, but ritual, and not chaos, but design. Families were not victims of chance. They were chosen sacrifices made to keep something alive, something that demanded a steady offering of human lives, and in return, gave power to those who obeyed it. The settlement became both altar and pris, on a place where blood was currency and silence was law. And while the nation marched toward its future of railroads, factories, and expansion, these people were being consumed in the shadows of the mountains, sacrificed to keep the system of control running smoothly. You are not hearing about disappearance. You are hearing about an economy of fear, built on flesh and silence. By 1840, the pattern was undeniable, but the pattern itself was the very reason it remained hidden. 97 disappearances across 27 years meant every few months, another life, another family, another bloodline was removed. Yet no newspaper carried the truth. No official record marked the numbers. Because records are written by those who profit from forgetting. The silence was too clean, too complete to be natural. It had the stench of design. Men who questioned too deeply were branded as drunks, lunatics, or heretics. Women who tried to speak of the sounds at night were accused of hysteria or witchcraft. The machine of suppression was in full motion, and it worked with a precision that revealed its hand. The system was not only erasing bodies, it was erasing memory and shaping reality itself. Imagine the power to make whole families disappear, and then to make the world believe they never existed. That is not just control of people, that is control of history, of truth itself. What happened in the Appalachian settlement was not random violence. It was proof that human lives could be harvested, like crops under the cover of wilderness and myth. And every man in power who closed a file, stamped accident, or whispered frontier danger was a willing priest in this dark ritual. There were journals found hidden, decades later, written by travelers who passed through at the edge of the settlement. They spoke of strange marks carved into trees, spirals, and symbols, older than Christian faith. They described fires burning in the forest at night and figures moving around them in silence, figures dressed in garments of animal hides and masks made of carved wood. They claimed that these were not settlers at all, but something older that had merged with the settlers or taken them over. These journals were ignored, ridiculed, burned by officials who called them superstition. Yet, when the same marks appeared again, carved into courthouse stones or scratched into church basements, the silence grew louder because the truth was too dangerous to admit. This was not just one settlement. This was a template, a method, a rehearsal for how power would feed itself in the shadows, while the surface world marched blindly forward. By 1847, the land itself began to speak for those who were no longer alive. Farmers who tried to settle near the abandoned cabins reported that their livestock refused to graze. Animals would panic at night, eyes fixed on the tree line, as if watching something that humans could not see, travelers described. Hearing voices carried on the wind, sometimes crying, sometimes chanting, always just beyond comprehension. When investigators came from nearby towns, they found nothing but silence. Yet many of them returned, changed. Some resigned their posts soon after whispering of nightmares and faces in the dark. Some vanished themselves, never reaching home again. What grew clear was that the Appalachian settlement had become a kind of sinkhole of human life, swallowing not just bodies, but identities and even sanity. The disappearances were not accidents. They were the deliberate feeding of something that required both blood and fear to sustain itself. Those in power knew it, because their response was never to expose, but to bury the truth deeper. The more people vanished, the more land was seized, the more resources were claimed by officials, banks and church interests, all under the pretense of failed settlement. These were not just sacrifices. They were transactions, each life traded to maintain an invisible order where institutions gained control while the victims were erased as if they had never walked the earth. Some whispered that the people who vanished were not killed, but transformed, absorbed into the ritual itself, that their voices became the chants heard in the night, and their faces became the shapes moving through the trees. Whether death or transformation, the result was the same. 97 gone, countless more erased from memory, and a system fed by blood and silence grew stronger under the mountain canopy. The truth of this place was too dangerous for the common man to know. Beck. Ace once seen, it could not be unseen. It showed that power is not built on law or progress, but on sacrifice, on bodies offered and memories buried. The Appalachian settlement was not a failure of frontier survival. It was proof of how darkness can be institutionalized, how horror can be hidden within the machinery of society until it looks like ordinary history. By the mid-1850s, the whispers of the Appalachian settlement were not confined to the mountains anymore. They began to bleed into court records, church sermons, and even the private letters of men who shaped the nation. Judges who traveled through the region wrote cryptic notes about the strange quiet of the land, about eyes watching them from behind the trees, and about feeling as though every decision they signed afterward was being guided by something older and unseen. Receipts who visited spoke of parishioners confessing to unspeakable acts performed in the woods beneath crude altars made of stone and bone. Yet not one sermon condemned it outright. Instead, they spoke in parables, warning the flock of wolves in sheep's clothing, warning of demons who wear human faces, but never naming the settlement directly. It was as if they were under oath not to reveal it. The system of silence had grown beyond the town. It had become woven into American progress itself. For every rail, laid for every new church built, for every courthouse rising from the earth. There was the shadow of a vanished voice whispering beneath it. 97 lives were gone, yet their absence served as mortar for the walls of institutions that claimed to bring order and civilization. The deeper truth was this: the settlement was not a forgotten corner of wilderness. It was a proving ground, a place where power learned how to erase people and profit from their erasure. The blueprint would be used again and again, native tribes relocated in silence, whole communities destroyed by industry and written off as accident, immigrant workers crushed under labor and erased from the record. Each time the same ritual repeated, blood-consumed memory, erased power demanded, and all of it hidden beneath the language of progress, destiny, and God. Men in suits and robes claimed they were building a nation, but their foundation was no different. Not from the fires that burned in those woods. Sacrifice cloaked in silence. This is why the story of the settlement is dangerous, because it reveals that what we call history is not a tale of growth, but a tale of consumption. The powerful feed and the rest disappear. The settlers who dared to stay in the shadow of the Appalachian hills lived in a silence that was not natural. It was not the peaceful hush of forests or the comforting quiet of snow. It was a silence that pressed against the skin like a warning, a silence heavy with the weight of something watching. The families who farmed the land knew better than to speak aloud about what lingered beyond the tree line. They knew better than to call out at night or light fires that burned too brightly. They lived as if they were trespassers, not owners of the soil, and in truth, that is exactly what they were. For every man who tried to resist, who sought to claim the land with pride, who raised his voice against the unseen forces, his name became one of the 97. For every woman who tried to shield her children, who spoke of fleeing by dawn, she too was swallowed. Sometimes entire households were gone by morning, leaving only food cooling on the table or a lantern burning until it guttered out. No bodies, no tracks, just absence. Those who survived long enough learned the ritual of obedience. They did not question the priest who spoke in parables. They did not protest when officials came and left without explanation. They knew silence was survival. They became prisoners of a land that devoured the rebellious and rewarded only the submissive. Wanderers, travelers, and lost souls who stumbled upon the settlement rarely left with clear memory. Some spoke of circles carved into the ground with ash. Some spoke of men with hollow eyes standing between trees as if waiting for instruction. Others spoke of hearing the cries of children, though no children could be found. Each account contradicted the other, yet all carried the same truth. There was something in the settlement that was not meant to be seen, not meant to be named, and it demanded a price for every trespasser. Those who vanished were not merely victims. They were offerings fed to a hunger that stretched back before America was even imagined. The settlers did not live. They endured, and endurance itself became a ritual. The deeper you look into the mystery of the 97, the clearer it becomes that the settlement was not abandoned to chance or cursed by mere legend, but managed by something larger and colder, something that understood how fear could erase people more effectively than bullets or chains. Official records were scrubbed clean with the precision of an archivist, trained not to preserve, but to destroy. Bees of the missing were struck through in census rolls. Families were listed as relocated, though no trace of them ever surfaced. County clerks noted nothing but deaths by accident or illness, while church registers turned blank where baptisms and burials should have been. Institutions which were meant to guard truth became the very machines that buried it. If men vanished in the forest, their farms were sold within months. If a mother and her children disappeared, her land was folded into the holdings of a powerful few. The pattern was unmistakable, a quiet harvesting of both lives and property. The settlement became less a community and more a feeding ground, not only for whatever prowled in the dark, but for the men in suits who profited from that darkness. And here lies the most dangerous truth, that institutions and ancient forces are not separate but intertwined. Those who wore the collar, those who held the gavel, those who signed the deeds, all knew the hunger that dwelt in the hills. They may not have spoken its name, but they bowed to it, and in return they were rewarded. The missing were never mourned by the powerful, because their absence filled ledgers and secured dominion. The settlement became a lesson in how silence serves control, how fear cements obedience, and how those in power need not spill blood themselves when the land itself can be made complicit. 97 souls were more than vanished. They were converted into wealth and authority, and every time their names were erased from paper, it was not only memory that died, but resistance. The rituals of the Appalachian settlement were not written in books or etched in stone. They were lived in silence and repetition. They were acts of control, disguised as tradition. Families were told never to whistle after sunset, for sound carried more than music, it carried invitation. They were warned never to hang mirrors facing windows, for reflections could become doorways for what waited outside. They were taught to leave offerings of bread or salt on their doorsteps, though no one ever confessed to seeing what consumed them. These were not customs born of superstition, but rules engineered to break the mind. Each ritual trained obedience. Each restriction taught submission. Every act reinforced the idea that survival was possible only if you followed commands. This was psychological warfare dressed as folklore. The priest who oversaw the settlement did not thunder sermons about heaven or hell. Instead, he spoke in hushed parables about shadows that walked as men, about debts that must be paid, about silence as the only shield. His voice became the law, not because it promised salvation, but because it promised survival. He was less a shepherd of souls and more a warden of a prison without walls. And the settlers obeyed, not out of faith, but out of terror. Yet terror is the most effective faith. When children asked questions, they were silenced with fear. When travelers stumbled upon the settlement, they were welcomed with kindness, but marked for disappearance. Rituals that seemed harmless were, in fact, a mechanism for control. They created a people who no longer asked why, who no longer remembered freedom, who lived as offerings, waiting for their turn. The 97 were not just victims, they were symbols to the rest. They were examples carved into absence. They were the unspoken warning that resistance meant erasure. And so, generation after generation, the settlement endured, not by living, but by dying, slowly feeding both the land and the institutions that thrived from its silence. When whispers of the disappearances began to slip beyond the mountains, outsiders came. Curious. Journalists, statesmen, even wandering preachers. But they never returned the same. Some never returned at all. Their reports vanished as swiftly as the settlers themselves. Letters sent to distant newspapers were intercepted or rewritten. Accounts that did manage to surface were dismissed as hysteria, drunken tales, or the ramblings of men who had lost their way in the wilderness. Yet, the pattern remained the same. Each investigator either disappeared into the woods or returned with eyes hollow and tongues bound. They spoke no longer of corruption or mystery, but only of isolation, of weather, of poverty. Their silence was not natural. It was engineered. Records reveal that one journalist, a man named Elias Mather, traced the settlement's missing to a series of hidden clearings where he claimed to see fires burning at midnight. He sent a letter describing masks carved of animal bone and chanting that sounded less like prayer and more like a pact. The letter never reached the paper, only fragments remain, and Elias himself was listed as dead by fever, though no burial was ever recorded. Others who pressed too far were ruined through character assassination, their reputations slaughtered before their bodies could be. No one with influence dared to challenge the settlement again, for every attempt to pull the truth into daylight was smothered by shadow. The outsiders became part of the story, their silence, a testimony that the system guarding the secret stretched far beyond the hills. It was not merely the land that consumed the curious, but an invisible network of hands, ready to erase anything that threatened to expose the true machinery of control. The lesson is chilling but clear once you step too close to forbidden knowledge. You are marked not always with death, but with silence. A silence so complete, it rewrites your history until even your memory betrays you. The settlement was not just hiding a secret. It was protected by a power that could bend men, break institutions, and devour truth itself. The Appalachian wilderness was more than backdrop. It was accomplice. The land itself seemed alive, watching, swallowing, and never giving back what it took. The settlers spoke of valleys where sound refused to carry, where shouts fell dead in the air, as if devoured by unseen mouths. There were ridges that shifted beneath the feet, trails that appeared one night and vanished the next, as though the forest itself was leading wanderers to their end. The trees grew so thick that sunlight fractured into shards, giving the illusion of walls and cages. The land was the perfect camouflage, a labyrinth designed not for shelter, but for entrapment. Some claimed to see shapes moving between the trees, long after the last fire had gone out. Pale figures slipping in silence, their presence too deliberate to be animal, too fluid to be human. Hunters reported finding deer carcasses with their bones rearranged like crude altars. Travelers stumbled upon circles of stones that pulsed with heat. Though no fire burned within, the soil was not just dirt. It was memory soaked with blood offerings and fear. And when storms rolled over the mountains, it felt less like weather and more like judgment. The thunder cracking not above, but inside the skull. The settlers used this land as justification for their rituals, insisting the earth itself demanded sacrifice. The priest would tell them that the mountains were ancient watchers, guardians of debts, older than man, and that those who disappeared were chosen, not lost. But in truth, the land was the perfect prison for corruption. It erased tracks, muffled screams, and gave power to those who understood its silence. The 97 who vanished did not simply vanish. They were consumed by a landscape that conspired with men and with something older than men. The forest was both executioner and grave unmarked, eternal. And those who dared to fight the system quickly learned that even the land itself would betray them, bending paths, swallowing hope, and guiding them into the jaws of a darkness that wanted nothing but their surrender. The vanishings were never random, they were orchestrated. Each disappearance was not tragedy, but transaction. The settlement masked its hunger as ritual, disguising a machine of control as devotion. The 97 souls were offerings, not to God, not to the church, not to justice, but to a power hidden in the marrow of the mountains. The priest told them that their survival depended on sacrifice, that without blood the settlement would be swallowed whole by curses older than the Appalachians themselves. He spoke of spirits that demanded flesh, yet his eyes revealed no faith, only the cold precision of a man maintaining order. Through terror, every life taken strengthened his dominion. The disappearances served as theater, a constant reminder that anyone could be next. The missing became myth. their names whispered like forbidden incantations. Yet beneath the fear lay something darker. The missing gave shape to power in the shadows, each vanishing, fueling an unspoken pact. It was not death alone that mattered, but the secrecy, the silence, the way the community learned to obey without question. Fear was a weapon, but obedience was the harvest. The settlement had become an altar. The people, the sacrifices, the land, the witness, each act of vanishing reinforced a truth no one dared admit, that they were not residents, but prisoners, captives bound to a system disguised as faith. The priest did not simply rule, he fed. He fed the soil. He fed the shadows. He fed the myth that submission ensured safety. And for 27 years, this cycle turned like a hidden wheel, grinding men, women, and children into offerings wrapped in silence. 97 vanishings. 97 transactions. 97 steps into a darkness that bound the people tighter, with every scream swallowed by the forest. The vanishings were not punishment. They were the price of power paid again and again, until the people no longer remembered how to resist. The whispers began as faint as wind weaving through the trees, but they carried the weight of terror. When the 97th vanished, a truth too heavy to bury clawed its way to the surface. It was not only ritual, not only fear, not only the priest and his control. Something else was being fed, something that lived beneath the mountain itself. The land had always been wrong, its silence too heavy, its shadows too patient. There were places where animals refused to tread, where birds never sang, and where the soil reeked of iron, as if it remembered blood. The priest called these the hollow grounds. He warned never to linger there, never to listen too closely to the earth. Yet children who dared placed their ears against the dirt and swore they heard breathing. Others swore they felt warmth pulsing beneath their feet, as if the mountain itself carried a heart. Travelers reported strange lights weaving between the trees, not lanterns, not fireflies, but orbs of pale fire that moved with intent. Some saw shapes too tall, too thin to be human, gliding between the pines, eyes glowing like coals in a furnace. The priest dismissed these as visions, tests of faith, yet his warnings always ended in another disappearance. The people began to realize the vanishings were not only punishments, they were offerings. The missing were not gone, they were consumed. Their bodies were never found, because they were never meant to be found. They had been given to the thing in the earth, the ancient hunger that waited in silence, fed through ritual and obedience. Every act of disappearance was not just to control the people, but to keep the land itself from rising against them. The priest was not master, he was mediator. He fed his flock to the soil because he believed, if he stopped, the mountain would open and devour them all. In this revelation, fear deepened, not only of the priest, not only of silence, but of the land itself. The Setai lament was not haunted by myth. It was married to a hunger, older than history, one that knew no mercy, one that would take everything once it was no longer fed. The settlers began to see with eyes no longer clouded by obedience. They saw the priest not as a shepherd, but as a servant, bound to the same darkness they feared. He had not been the author of their torment. He had been the messenger. He had not created the hunger, he merely fed it, to delay its wrath. The mountain demanded blood, and the priest gave it to survive. But survival bought with silence is not survival at all. It is slavery, the villagers realized. Every generation had been offered every ritual, had been a chain, not of faith, but of feeding. The settlement was not a community, it was a pasture. They were not people, they were livestock. The air itself became heavy with this knowledge. Every whisper of wind through the trees felt like the exhale of a creature watching. Every creak of wood within their cabins felt like the bones of the earth shifting beneath them. Men once brave enough to venture into forests now clung to their fires. Women whispered to their children to never leave the hearth lest the soil itself reach for them. Yet within this terror, a strange defiance began to grow. If the priest was only a servant, then the master could be defied, and if the master could be defied, then perhaps the cycle could be broken. They asked themselves the question none had dared before. What if they stopped feeding the earth? What if they let the hunger rise and face it instead of serving it? The thought alone was rebellion. The priest warned that to deny the ritual would mean ruin, that the ground would open and swallow them whole. But despair gives birth to courage where comfort cannot. The people began to wonder if the true punishment was not in what the earth might do, but in what their silence had already done. 97 gone, 97 erased into soil and shadow. How many more would they allow before they admitted the greater sin was obedience itself? The night grew restless. The people grew restless. And somewhere beneath the mountain, the breathing grew louder, as if it had heard their doubt, as if it had been waiting for the moment they would finally choose. The first act of rebellion was small, but in that smallness was a weight heavier than centuries. They refused the ritual for one moon. They dug no pit. They shed no blood. They offered nothing to the soil. For the first time in memory, the mountain went unfed. The priest wept before them, begging that they reconsider. But his words rang hollow now. They saw the fear in his eyes and knew it was not for their souls, but for his own life, if the entity turned against him. The days that followed were unnervingly still. The forest animals that once stirred at dawn seemed absent. The birds no longer called. The silence of the wilderness pressed against them like a held breath, waiting to be released. On the third night, the earth began to shift. Houses trembled, as if unseen hands were pressing against their walls. The ground cracked near the well, and water, once pure, began to flow black and thick, with a stench that burned the lungs. Crops withered overnight, not from weather, but from something deeper, as if roots themselves recoiled from the soil. Children woke screaming not from dreams, but from voices that whispered their names from beneath the floorboards. Men who stood guard swore they saw shapes forming in the mist, shapes with human outlines, but faces swallowed by shadows. Still the people refused to break. The fear was immense, yet the anger that had festered was greater. They would not return to slavery, even if the price was their blood. This defiance was not born of courage alone, but of a deeper truth. When you strip everything from a man, his land, his hope, his freedom, his future, the only thing left is the choice of how he dies. They chose to die, standing instead of kneeling. But the mountain is old, older than their rage, older than their rebellion. It had devoured generations before, and it would not be denied forever. It began to test them with subtle cruelties, shadows moving just beyond the core, neurovision water that whispered secrets in a language no man should hear. The rebellion had begun, but the mountain was not finished. It was waiting, biding, ready to answer in full. The rebellion spread like fire through dry grass. Once the people tasted even a breath of freedom, there was no turning back. Families who once cowered now armed themselves with torches and blades, forged in secret. They stormed the home of the priest, dragging him from his chambers, where relics of bone and parchment were hidden. The villagers saw with their own eyes the symbols carved into the walls. symbols older than their ancestors etched in languages they could not speak, and yet they felt them burn into their minds. The priest pleaded that these marks were their only protection, that without them, the mountain would swallow all of them whole. But his words no longer carried weight. He was cast into the very pit where generations had been sacrificed. The crowd gathered around as he screamed into the void that had taken so many. The echo of his voice did not return, as if the mountain itself had claimed him. The people thought they had won that night, but victory carries its own shadow. In the days that followed, a storm rolled over the valley, unlike anything recorded in memory. The sky was bruised purple and black. Lightning danced across the peaks, as though the heavens themselves had been split apart. Rain did not fall as water, but as thick ash covering the crops and choking the streams. The animals returned, but they were not the same. Their eyes glowed in the dark, their bodies twisted as if molded by hands that had never known mercy. They wandered into homes and stood silently at the bedsides of children, vanishing when touched. The villagers began to whisper that the priest had been right. But now it was too late, for every defiant act demanded a price, and the mountain was collecting. What had begun as liberation was mutating into a descent, far worse than the chains they had broken. Men, who once led the uprising, began turning against one another, accusing neighbors of sabotage and betrayal. True couvent est evaporated. The rebellion fractured, leaving only fear and suspicion as its foundation. And in the silence of night, a new sound rose from beneath the earth. Not the whispers of the past, but something louder, deeper, like the voice of the mountain itself awakening. The voice of the mountain grew into a roar, shaking the ground with every breath. Houses split apart as if the soil itself rejected the weight of human lives. Fires erupted from beneath the earth, spewing smoke that carried faces of the lost into the sky. Mothers swore they saw their vanished children, staring down at them through the black haze. Their cries filled the night, but no tears could wash away what they had awakened. The rebellion that had started with courage now collapsed into chaos. Villagers fled into the forest, but the trees themselves seemed to twist and close around them, trapping them inside paths that once led to freedom, now circled back to the ruins of their homes. It was as though the land had become a cage, woven by an intelligence that despised escape. Men tried to fight it. They swung axes at the glowing-eyed animals that wandered silently through the streets, but every blow was swallowed by the air, leaving no wound, no victory. Their weapons meant nothing against forces older than steel. The elders tried chanting prayers, begging for mercy, but their voices only deepened the rumble beneath the ground. The mountain was not listening, because it had never been a guardian. It was a prison, and they had torn open the locks, unleashing what should never have been touched. Bodies disappeared without sound. One moment, a man was screaming for his family. The next, he was simply gone, leaving nothing but the imprint of his weight in the ash. Whole families vanished, as if swallowed by invisible jaws. The people realized with dread that the priest had not been their enemy. He had been their shield. Their defiance had stripped away the last barrier between them and the truth that their settlement had been built upon something unholy, something that needed constant blood to stay asleep. Now it was awake, and nothing could put it back into silence. The air itself became heavy, pressing down on here lungs. Men collapsed, clutching their chests. Children whimpered and fell into stillness. Those who survived felt themselves being watched, not by eyes in the trees, not by beasts in the night, but by something vast beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was waiting for them to surrender. The last survivors gathered at the edge of the forest, their faces lit by the dull glow of burning homes. Behind them, the mountain pulsed like a living heart, each beat rattling the ground beneath their feet. They thought they had escaped, but the forest did not release them. Its branches arched into a dome, sealing the sky above them, and the wind carried whispers of names of every soul that had vanished. In 27 years, the survivors began to understand the truth, that the disappearances had never been random, that the settlement itself had always been the offering. The land did not demand the blood of outsiders alone. It fed on its own children too. The priests, the rituals, the rules. Every silence had been designed to keep the balance. But rebellion had broken the seal. Now the debt was due in full. The ground opened beneath the trees and figures began to crawl out, not flesh, not bone, but shadows. Shaped like the missing, each with hollow eyes, burning like embers. They reached for the living with hands of smoke that felt heavier than stone, pulling bodies down into the earth. The screams were swallowed instantly, leaving only the whispering wind. The few who resisted ran deeper into the forest, but the trees bent and twisted, trapping them in endless circles, until exhaustion forced them to collapse, and the shadows claimed them too. In the end, there were no survivors. Only silence. The settlement was gone, erased as if it had never existed. The mountain stood still once more, but its heart did not sleep. It beat slowly, patiently, waiting for the next ones who would come, with axes and fire, and the arrogance to think they could conquer the land. They would build again, and they too would vanish, for the cycle was older than nations, older than empires carved into the bones of the earth itself. And you who have heard this story are no longer outside it. You have touched the secret that was meant to stay buried. You have seen the face of a hunger that is never satisfied. And now the question remains. Will you walk away unchanged, or will the mountain remember your name when the night grows heavy and the ground beneath your bed begins to breathe?